reported by ESPN's Chris Lowe that it was announced that Bryan Harsin is going to take over as UCal's offensive coordinator under Justin Wilcox offensive staff. And, for those of you who don't know, the connection between Bryan Harsin and Justin Wilcox goes all the way back to the early 2000s when Justin Wilcox was the defensive coordinator. Bryan Harsin was the offensive coordinator under Chris Peterson over at Boise State. And, when you look at this, hire, I mean, you obviously ask yourself, hey, there's a natural connection there. Bryan Harsin's been out of football since 2022, and that, tumultuous firing at Auburn. I mean, you heard Bo Nix pretty much say that, it was miserable to be under Bryan Harsin. A lot of offensive coordinator turnover during Harsin's tenure at Auburn. And quite frankly, a lot of what Harsin was trying to do was kind of recreate that magic that he had at Boise State and translate it over to Auburn. But I'm sure as he quickly knew, when you're going up against guys like Nick Saban, Jimbo Fisher, and Kirby Smart, you have to kind of tweak things in a way where, you can't just rely on your offensive prowess to get things through, and you actually have to, be able to recruit as well. And it also doesn't help too that you're not really from the area too, because he's a Boise State alumni too. So there's all those things kind of put together, really made his tenure pretty, tumultuous, and just ultimately didn't work out, which leads me to the conclusion that obviously there weren't many great names out there in general. I would definitely argue if I were Justin Wilcox, I'd probably be sitting there to myself, man, I really wish I had Jake Spavital, especially after the season that Baylor just had with Sawyer Robinson, who's actually been really impressive to watch this year. But if you're a UCal fan, I'd be pretty pissed off about this, quite frankly. And I'm here to tell you, I liked what Justin Wilcox said in his press conferences at the beginning of the year. ACC channel does a really good job at being able to interview all the different coaches, kind of talking about philosophies and strategies and whatnot. And one of the things that Justin Wilcox touched upon was, being more aggressive on the offensive side of the ball, really winning in the trenches and playing a much more complementary style of football. And unfortunately, you really didn't see that much this year on the offensive side of the ball. They were ranked 82nd in terms of scoring production. And, I think Fernando Mendoza is a solid quarterback. I'm not saying he's great. I mean, he's a young kid. He's a sophomore, still kind of finding his way. But when you have nobody to throw to, and also I'd like to add that they had absolutely no offensive line whatsoever. He's getting hit over and over. He's really not quite that athletic. And you can't rely on their defense to be able to bail you out of games all the time. I mean, let's look at this stat. UCal was 1-5 this year in one score games. I mean, when you look at the games like Pitt and NC State, Miami, Florida State, I mean, they barely squeaked by versus Stanford, where they had to essentially come back at the very last second of the game to even get that one through. So I would argue they probably shouldn't even be playing a bowl game versus UNLV this year, the way that they've been playing. But yes, their defense has bailed them out at a lot of moments this year, particularly in their secondary, who's been phenomenal. They lead the FBS in terms of interceptions. But when you look at this hire, I mean, let's even look down at Justin Wilcox's history in terms of recruiting. 39th in 2024, 46th in 2023, and 54th in 2022. And when you look at that, I mean, I would say not very strong, all things considered. When you're playing in the ACC, I mean, you need to be at bare minimum in the top 30. So for you to not be where you need to be in recruiting, you're also not hitting the transfer portal as hard enough, but you're also struggling with the balance of also UCal, in a sense, doesn't really give a shit about the football program as well. I mean, Justin Wilcox has been coach there since 2017. I think he's a solid enough guy. I think he says the right things. I do think he does legitimately care about the program. When you sit there and say to yourself, hey, he's only had one 8-win season, and that was back all the way in 2019. And even when you go back and you look at this UCal program, I think what bothers me the most about UCal is I think there is a lot of potential over there in general, but then you say to yourself, UCal has had the same problems year after year after year. And what are those problems? It's the incompetency to be able to hire an offensive coordinator, and most importantly, not being able to recruit at all. And if I were Justin Wilcox and I said to myself, hey, my biggest strength probably is not recruiting on the defensive side of the ball, we pretty much have that taken care of, right? But if you can go out there and get somebody who can, coach the offensive side of the ball, but can even tweak the recruiting in a sense, can we at least get to, the top 35, bring in a couple 4-star guys who can immediately contribute and kind of work your way up in a sense of, at least having some decent protection. Because I mean, you've been watching some of UCal's offense this year, and when your quarterback has no time to throw, your running game is not really getting you anywhere. When Jaden Knott is a solid enough player, but it's like there's just so many different things that are just not really gelling together. And I'm sure UCal fans, Golden Bear fans, are certainly getting frustrated with all that too. But in terms of them in general, I mean, it just seems like it's just not really kind of jiving together. And when you look at Bryan Harsin's tenure at Auburn, I mean, definitely wasn't well liked. Decent enough offensive coordinator, probably a crappy person if we're just talking about the person. But if you're UCal, I don't see how you can possibly be excited about this hire, because in many ways, if you look back at the offensive coaching hires that he's had 4 coordinators in the past 4 seasons. And, when you don't have that sort of stability there, it definitely raises questions in terms of what you can bring to a program and can you really turn this around? Because you got to ask yourself too. I mean, there's only so many more chances you can give a guy like Justin Wilcox too. Because I mean, is he a solid enough coach? Yeah, he's a solid enough coach. He says the right things, and I do think he's a likable guy. But there comes a push and a pull where you need to start seeing some more consistent results from Justin Wilcox. I mean, content. Sometimes you can be a type of program where you're content with 6 or 7 wins on a season. But if you really want to get back to you guys when you had Marshawn Lynch and Aaron Rodgers, and you were flirting with the top 12 with when you had Jeff Tedford, you kind of sit there and say to yourself, there definitely needs to be some tweaks in here. And to me, the primary issue isn't so much Bryan Harsin as a play caller, which we don't even know if he's going to be calling plays. But the real issue at hand is Bryan Harsin doesn't resolve any of the issues that Justin Wilcox really has at the moment, which is there's no offensive stability. Fernando Mendoza just entered the transfer portal, and on top of that, he can't recruit. He went under Auburn in his 2 seasons. They had their 2 worst recruiting classes, but in the history of Auburn college football, by a wide margin too. It was even close, by the way. So when you piece it all together and you kind of say to yourself, hey, Justin Wilcox pretty much hired his buddy from Boise State, and in many ways kind of trying to reinvigorate that sort of energy that you had at Boise. For all those reasons, it just doesn't get me excited about this hire. And I do hope I'm wrong, because I do ask myself if you can have the UCal type of defense with any sort of competency on the offense side of the ball, I think they would have been a lot more entertaining to watch this year. Now, granted, especially going back and forth and watching the Pitt game, I think there were definitely a lot more opportunities for UCal to win some games. But when push comes to shove, if you sit there and say to yourself, Bryan Harsin at UCal, I'm sorry, but I just don't know how you can be that excited about this move if you're a Golden Bears supporter.